Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. So recently we added Mongo DB support on Turbo 360. So I figured this would be a good time to do a very basic Mongo DB tutorial. Hey guys, how's it going? Where, hope you're doing well. Excuse me, let me just turn the audio off. Recently we added Mongo DB support. Sorry about that. So in this tutorial, we're going to set up a very simple project and connect it to a Mongo database locally, as well as on a staging server on Turbo, so that you can use your own MongoDB as opposed to the data store if you don't want to use the data store, which is fine. So that's pretty much it. I do expect you to know some basic Node Express and how to set up a project on Turbo and whatnot. And we're going to use the Mongoose ORM to set up our Mongo database and connect to our Node Express project. So hopefully you understand the concepts there. So let's go ahead and get started. You're going to need, obviously, Node.js. So go ahead and install this if you don't already have it. Make sure you have the LTS installed for that. And you're going to need the Turbo CLI as well as, obviously, a local Mongo database. So make sure you have all that set to go. This is going on YouTube Live. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop a question in the chat box, and I'll try and get back to you. And yeah, and that's basically it. So let's go ahead and get started. So head over to your terminal, and we're going to start this from scratch. So you're going to need, again, make sure you have the Node.js installed. We are going to use Turbo for our hosting, so make sure you have an account on turbo360.co, which is obviously free. And then make sure you have an account on MLab. We're going to use the MLab service for hosting our Mongo database, and that's also free, so you don't have to worry about paying for that. And then last but not least, make sure you have the Turbo CLI. So you just do sudo npm i-g turbo CLI, and that way you will have the most updated version of Turbo installed on your machine. And in this case, that version is Turbo version right here. You want to make sure you test your Mongo installation, so you can do that by doing mongo -- version, and you can see what version of Mongo you're running. Obviously, I'm running 4.0.1, and yeah, that's basically it. All right, so let's get into it. So let's create a new project on our desktop. Let's call it Turbo New Mongo Demo. DB into the Mongo demo project and run the npm install. So this is a Node Express project we just created right here. So given that's Node Express, you should know that we need to run the npm install to install all the dependencies. So go ahead and do that. And while that's running, head over to turbo360.co and into your account, and let's create a new project. So click over here and then click on Sites. And then click over here, create a new project called Mongo Demo. You don't need a description. You can just leave it blank and click Create Site. I'm not going to do it here because I already have it, but when you're done, you should have this. You should be looking at this. And what we're going to need is the app ID for today, and that's it. So go ahead and copy the app ID so that we can connect our local project source files to this Turbo remote so that we have our staging environment ready to go. So the installation over here is done. Let's go ahead and connect the projects, the Turbo app, and then paste in your app ID. And that will then connect your local source files to your remote. And then do Turbo dev server just to make sure everything works. So once this is up and running, you want to head over to localhost 3000 right here, and you should see this. And that is your scaffolded project. So this is the base scaffold of pretty much every Turbo project. That means everything worked. If you didn't see this, if you don't see this, excuse me, pause the video and make sure that you figure out what went wrong. And then go ahead back to your terminal and do Control-C to turn off your local database, your local server, excuse me. And then next you want to do Turbo login, and that'll prompt you for the email and password for your account so that you can deploy to your staging environment. Again, I'm not going to do it here because I'm already logged in. You might already be logged in too, depending on whether or not you've used Turbo in the past. But either way, you can just go ahead and log in again. So next thing we're going to do is a quick deploy to make sure our staging environment also works. So go ahead and do turbo deploy. And once we confirm this, then we can be confident that everything is in proper working order, and then we can begin our actual project setup specifically for Mongo and Mongoose. Okay, so the deploy is complete. Here's my staging URL. You should have your own version as well, so go ahead and paste that into your browser and make sure you see the same thing, which clearly I do. So everything is working on local as well as staging. So we are now ready to get started. So open up your project in your text editor of choice. So here I'm going to use Sublime. And click on the app.js, and here you'll see the project config, essentially, the project setup. So over here on line 4 is where the app is instantiated. This is essentially the Express application, or it's called Vertex on the Turbo environment, which is really just an Express application with a few minor modifications to make it deployable on Turbo. But if you look down here, you'll see another configuration option where instantiation option where you can create the Vertex app using a config object. So what we're going to do, we're going to use that instead. We're going to take line 4 and remove it. And we're going to uncomment this line right here, like so. Now, if you step through the config object, you'll see a few basic parameters which are pretty easy to understand. Here we're setting the views directory, which is right here where we store our templates. We're defining our static directory over right here, which is where we keep our JavaScript, CSS, images, whatever. But more importantly, most importantly, here we have our DB attribute where we set the database configuration. Specifically, line 16 is the one that matters here, is where we set the database URL for our project. Now, we're not going to use this one, so comment that out. And instead, we're going to create another one where we connect our project to our local Mongo database. Because obviously we're going to be doing our testing locally first. So what you want to do here is set up a local Mongo URL. So that's going to be Mongo DB ://localhost, and then the name of the database. So we'll do Mongo -project. This is the local URL for our Mongo database, and this right here is going to be the name of our database. So if the database doesn't exist at this juncture, when we initially connect, it will create that database for us on our local Mongo server. And then if you look closely on line 26, you will see that we now instantiate our app using a config argument, which will then configure our project with these conditions. And then it connects the routes and whatnot. So let's go ahead and test this guy out. So if we head over back to our terminal and clear out the console, we can do turbo dev server and see if it works. Now right here, you'll see it says database connection failed. So notice what happened here. Database connection failed. In the DB configuration object, we have a callback which says on error, which basically is a function that will run if something went wrong. Well, clearly something went wrong because I'm not running a database server, right? So that's what happened. So let's Control C out of this. Let's turn off the web server, and let's run the database server. But before we do that, let's also have an onSuccess callback that we can see if the database connection succeeded. Connection success. Oh, thanks, David. Yeah, this will be on later, so let me know if you have any questions on that. Okay, so here we have an onSuccess callback, which should hopefully run if the database is successfully connected. So this time what we want to do is run the local Mongo server, right? So we want to do Command T to run it, to open up a new tab, and we do Mongo D like that, which is going to run our local Mongo server. and then we wait for this line to show up right here. So this is a port number. 27017 is the default port number for local Mongo instances. And now once you see this line, that means everything is up and running. So we can go back here to our web server again and try it again. And hopefully we'll see the success callback function, DB connection success. Great, so that's this callback right here, which worked. So we are now good to go. So our web server has successfully connected to our local Mongo instance. So that's good. So now we're ready to actually set up our Mongo stuff. So what we're going to do is create two models for this project. We're going to have a profile model as well as an order model. So this is going to simulate something somewhat of like an e-commerce store where users can order items and whatnot. However, it's not going to be a full-fledged application. It's not going to be like, there's not going to be a huge front end and whatnot. It's not going to be well designed or anything like that. The purpose of this tutorial is just to show you how to set up a Mongo, your project with Mongo and Mongoose. So it's just going to be basically just a REST API with those two resources. Let's go ahead and get that set up. So what we want to do in the root level of the project is create a new directory called models, which is typically where this stuff goes. And then we want to cd into that. And then we want to create our first schema for profile. And then let's cd back to the root, just because it's always a good idea to remember to be back there. And then inside the models directory, you'll see the profile.js file we just created. And in here is where we define the schema for the profile model. So first things first, we need to import Mongoose. That's our ORM, which will do most of the heavy lifting for us. And then we want to set up the actual profile schema, which is really just a function returned from this schema, an object returned from the schema function right here from the Mongoose library. This function takes a JSON input argument, so make sure you include that, like so. And then at the end, let's just export this because it's very easy to forget that. So, excuse me, we export this as a Mongoose model, like so, which is a function which takes our schema and creates a model for basically a collection for our Mongo database. So inside the schema is where we define the attributes of the model that we're working on, in this case, profile. So we're going to have a handful of attributes. So we're going to have a first name. That's going to take a JSON object. We're going to have last name, also a JSON object, to email, age, and password. Okay, so each of these have JSON objects where inside is where we define the data type of the attribute itself. So these are all strings except for age, which is a number. So here, let's define the data type of all of these. So these are all strings, except for age, which is a number. Okay, and technically this is enough, but really we can do a little bit better than this. We can add a few more parameters. Like for example, here we can add a default attribute, which in this case is an empty string. So what that means is if data is ever inserted into the database without the first name attribute being included, then the default value will take over. In this case, that will be an empty string. That way, there will always be something in place for that attribute, no matter what the profile user actually entered. So we can do that for all the strings. We don't want to do that for number because the age, excuse me, we don't want to do that for age because age is a number. So this doesn't even make sense. So here we want to put 0 instead without the quotation marks because that's a number instead of a string. So there are ways you can format this data automatically. So another option right here, for example, in email, is lowercase, and we want to set that to true. Let me explain why. In the case of an email, something like this, bob@gmail.com and all capital bob@gmail.com, these are both the same email, right? So the capitalization has no effect on the actual value of the email. But in terms of database queries, it does have an effect. If we queried for this, we will not get this back in return. So that's going to mess up our query structure. So really what we want to do is just standardize everything by lowercasing all emails. So no matter what the user enters into the actual form while signing up, it will be lowercased before it's inserted into the database. If we look at the first name attribute, and let's say we have a user named Bob, he may have entered his name like this, or he may have entered his name like this. Notice how in the second example, there is a trailing space. And in all likelihood, Bob did not mean to do that. That was probably a mistake. So really what we want to do is we want to take that out of his hands, and we want to remove those trailing white spaces as well as the preceding ones if they're found. And that's called trim. So we want to do trim, and we want to set that to true as well. That way, all this extra trailing white space as well as preceding white space won't be entered into the database. So we want to do that for first name, last name, email. We do not want to do it for password because that might be on purpose in the case of the password. Here we're getting all these sort of configuration options on these attributes for our schema, which is something that Mongoose provides us to make our data more consistent across collections, or I should say within collections. So that's nice because otherwise we'd have to keep track of that ourselves and find ways to keep our data consistent, and that can be very cumbersome. So here we have a very simple profile schema ready to go. So now let's go ahead and start interfacing with this schema to make sure everything works. So let's see here. If we go back to the app.js, you'll see that we have two routes connected for us by default by the scaffold, the index route and the API route. And the index route is what actually serves the home page. Like that's what actually takes care of this rendering right here. And so what we want to do is use the API route to return data from our database. And here in our API route, we have two sample endpoints, I should say. And so let's get rid of the second one. And in the first one, where it says :resource, let's remove that and replace it with profile. And let's get rid of these two. And let's say this is the profile endpoint. And so here, we can test this endpoint by running the local web server and then doing /API, because it's the API route, and then /profile. And then we should see in doing so, we should see this data output right here. So let's try that. So localhost /API/profile, and this is the profile endpoint. So that worked. So what that means is now we can use this endpoint right here to return the profile data from the actual database. So let's go ahead and do that. So we can import the profile model from the models directory. And then here is where we want to do a query for all the profiles currently in our database. So we want to do profile and then find, and then inside the find function, it takes a filter, query filters, but for now we're not going to use any, we're just going to do null. And this returns a promise, which of course gives us a then and a catch. So here we will do profiles, And then inside the success block, we will return the array of profiles. And inside the error block, we will just return an error message. Like so. And so we can use this to confirm whether or not the queries are successfully working within our Mongo connections. Let's go ahead and try that. So here, if I reload, I get an empty array, which of course is what we expect because right now our database is empty. So we don't have any profiles or really anything in the database. So far this is actually what we expect. So so far so good. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut this off. And in the next video, tomorrow, I'm going to continue this series where we will actually set up ways to insert data into the database and create some data for the database to return. So we will get that set up tomorrow. And then we will finish off with updating the database and deleting records as well. So yeah, that's it. Hopefully you got all this working so far. I will continue this series tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. And yeah, hope to see you there. Thanks.